The talk is Beyond Calories, so 21st Century Optimization for Athletes' Diet. And I think this is a really cool topic, and I think a bunch of the things that I want to talk about today are kind of the nutrition questions that keep me up at night. And I want to hopefully frame for you a new way of thinking about diets for athletes and then clients, even if they're non-athletes, maybe just like kind of a general population body composition weight loss client or an athlete, kind of thinking about how we structure their diets in a different way, and then also giving you some practical strategies on what you can actually do and how you can actually help and improve their diets. So a little bit of background about myself before we get started. So my name is Mike Roussell, and I have my PhD in nutrition from Penn State University. I've written several books. My most recent one is called The Meta-Shred Diet, which I wrote with Men's Health. I work as the nutrition advisor for Men's Health and have a column in the magazine called Ask the Nutrition Know-It-All, which is probably the most ego-driven column title that I've ever heard, so I can assure you I did not come up with it. That was when they came up with that. I've recently co-founded a company called Parabellum Partners, which is, we're working to develop nootropics, so products and supplements that can improve brain health. So kind of natural products that can improve brain health and function. And then also I work kind of as a consultant, speaker, continuing educator. My PhD background is in cardiovascular nutrition, so I actually do a lot of work in heart disease and diabetes and education to professionals in that way. Sports nutrition is really more my passion, and it's really what got me into nutrition in the first place. So kind of two questions to get us started to just think about and think about how we're going to frame today's talk. So the first question that I always ask myself is, how can we create the greatest metabolic capacity for performance and optimization of body composition within the context of what the client or athlete is willing to do? So when it comes to nutrition, I think there are two pieces, and we've generally only ever focused on one piece. So there's the nutritional science piece, right, which is kind of the food, like what are they going to eat, how, proteins, carbohydrates, fats, calories, there's that piece. But then there's also the how do they actually do it piece, which is what I call food logistics, which has generally been neglected in food. And that's really what the second part is within the context of what the athlete or client's willing to do. Like you can come up with great nutrition plans or great kind of nutrition interventions, but if the person's not gonna do it on a consistent basis, it's a total waste of your time. So I think one of the things to think about throughout this talk is, how do we get this to actually work in people's lives? And a lot of it is just through conversation and getting them to kind of buy into the ideas and the methods that we're talking about. Then the other piece is that we need to always consider the fluidity and relativity of metabolism. So I'm going to start this out talking about energy balance and kind of how we've always thought about energy balance. And it's really a static, rigid thing, kind of our traditional thoughts on energy balance and calories in, calories out. And one of the things that I hope that you get out of my talk is thinking about metabolism as really of a fluid thing that goes on in someone's body. And then it's also relative to the food that you're eating and your energy expenditure, and it can change as those things change, which is not a way that we've traditionally thought about metabolism. So kind of the big points in the overview, like I mentioned, we're going to talk first about energy balance, and then what I call kind of this 21st century approach, which is looking from a nutrient standpoint, what's the difference between essential and optimal? We've traditionally looked at nutrients on the nutrition side of things is what's essential, and then that's how we set needs and recommendations. But I think there's a big difference, what we're learning through research, especially through protein research, we'll talk a lot about, there's a difference between essential and optimal. Then look at the energy and signaling qualities of food. So looking beyond just calories, like the energy that a food contains, and then thinking about, well, how does that food then actually behave in our bodies, right, once we eat it? It's more than just energy. And then at the end, some practical diet building strategies. So first, let's talk about energy balance. So energy balance at the most basic level, right, is calories in versus calories out. If we need to maintain someone's weight, we just need to get this sort of balance. So this is really great for theoretical education. And I was in school probably until I was almost 30, so I've had my lion's share of theoretical education in my life. And for a little bit, I wanted to become a medical doctor. So I went to medical school for a couple years. So I've had like all kinds of theoretical education at a variety of different institutions and levels. And this is something that is taught kind of throughout. So what the first thing you do is you have this, I have the Harris-Benedict equation here. Like there are a handful. If you don't like the Harris-Benedict, like you can pick whatever equation you like. In my book, it's kind of 6 to 1, half dozen the other because there are so many other variables at play. But so if we're going to predict BMR, so if we're going to predict basal metabolic rate, you get age, height, weight, and sex. You plug it into this equation, and you get someone's basal metabolic rate. Then what you do is you factor in activity, right, to get total energy expenditure. So that's kind of how you would come up with how many calories is someone burning every day. Now, if we were going to look at something like weight loss, what we would need to do is then we structure a plan where the calorie intake is lower than the total energy expenditure, and you get weight loss, and it's that simple, right? But unfortunately, and if any of you have tried to do this, like it just doesn't work that way, right? It works that way for some people, and it works that way for the first week or so. But this is not always great for actually getting results. And I think a great way of showing this is if you ever have known someone or helped someone to train for a marathon, right? And the genesis for them training for a marathon is that they want to lose weight, right? Because they think in order to train for a marathon, I'm going to have to run a lot. Runners are skinny. Runners, like if I run a lot, then I'm going to lose weight, right? But it doesn't work out that way. And I know I've had a fair number of clients who have trained for marathons and not lost any weight and are kind of like, confused, somewhat disappointed, but also happy that they were able to run 26 miles. So what is that? And part of that is this thing with metabolism that we're talking about. And it's really pushed, unfortunately, by a lot of the ways that people engage in fitness and nutrition. So this is a screenshot from MyFitnessPal. And have any of you guys used MyFitnessPal or have some familiarity with it? So you can kind of set you answer a couple questions. I don't think they use the Harris-Benedict, but they give you a predicted energy expenditure, or you link it with your fitness tracker, and that gives you a predicted, your energy output. And then you enter in your calories for the day, you hit complete, and then it'll say this: if every day were like today, you'd weigh 200 pounds in 5 weeks. So basically what they do is they just look at the difference between your expenditure and your intake, and then they scale that out over 5 weeks, and they subtract it from your body weight, and then 200 pounds. So if I were to do this, and I were to just enter in 250 calories in my food journal, right? I just decided to log breakfast, and then I hit complete, it would be like, congratulations, in 5 weeks, if every day were like today, you'd weigh 150 pounds, right? And it kind of sends the wrong message. The message would be, if you grossly undereat, or if you exercise a ton, whatever you need to do to create that deficit or that gap between energy in and energy out, that's going to drive weight loss, right? And it doesn't work. So I think we really need to look at energy balance through a different lens and kind of a different way. And for me, I think with a lot of processes in the body, that if you take this kind of evolutionary survival view of the body, that explains most biological adaptations, right? Even on the cellular level. Like if a cell is trying to survive, that's kind of how the process works in biochemistry. So here, sorry, the red's a little washed out with the bright lights. So let's kind of look at that through this lens. So if we have basal metabolic rate and we increase activity a ton, right, more, then we're gonna get more total energy expenditure. So if you do that, you would then think more total energy expenditure, you get more weight loss, you end up like this good-looking gentleman doing bicep curls, right? That it's very simple. It's kind of this very simplified way of weight loss. And what this does is this relies on, and kind of the MyFitnessPal app example, relies on what's called the additive theory of energy balance. So this theory is that there's an ongoing linear relationship between total activity and total energy expenditure. So that the more exercise I do, the more calories I'm going to burn, and if I keep doing more and more and more, I'm just going to burn more and more calories. And so from an athletic standpoint, this is kind of, I call it the he'll run it off mindset, right? If you ever have athletes who maybe have a little too much fun in the off season, right? And then they come and preseason starts and they're a little overweight, and the coach's opinion will be like, well, that's fine, he'll just run it off, which basically just means I'm just going to run them into the ground, and then eventually they'll get to the weight that they should be. And what this does is it uses this mentality so that you feel you have practice, and then you have extra conditioning, and then you have weight training, and all this is driving total energy expenditure up to kind of optimize body composition, which makes a really nice graphic, but it doesn't actually work in real life. And so if we return to this kind of survival idea, and we think of these are like real hunter-gatherers, not like the hunter-gatherer sitting in Starbucks drinking the almond milk latte, having a cookie made from coconut flour. Like, these are legitimate hunter-gatherers. And so for them, the additive theory of energy balance doesn't really work. Because if you think, I know I don't look like a hunter-gatherer, but if I'm a hunter-gatherer, right? I grew up in the country, so I could be in theory. So if I'm a hunter-gatherer A, and then my friend is hunter-gatherer B, and we both need to go find food, I have to go 5 miles to kill the rabbit that I need to eat. My friend has to go 25 miles to find a rabbit to eat, right? So if he has to go 25 miles, he has to go 5 times further than I do. That means with the additive theory of energy balance, he'd need to burn 5 times as many calories to find that piece of food. That is not very good for survival, right? That there needs to be some sort of internal system that says, we're going to slow things down, because what if that 25 miles tomorrow is 50, right? And so that's how this he'll just run it off theory kind of falls apart. So here are the 2 different examples. On this side of the left, we have this additive theory of energy balance. These are kind of like just internal systems, basal metabolic rate, things like that are burning calories. And then here's physical activity. So as physical activity increases, right, we have total energy expenditure here, that it increases on a linear basis. That's kind of traditional thought. Then over here, this is the constrained theory of total energy expenditure. Is that as physical energy, and this is in a calorie neutral environment, so calorie intake is staying the same. So that as physical activity increases, your total energy expenditure, it starts to cap off at a certain level, and you also get this downregulation in other processes, right? So that at some point when the gap between energy expenditure and energy intake becomes so great, your body starts to say, like, this could be a 50-mile day till we find food. Like, let's bring it down. Let's rein these internal processes in. Let's become more efficient. Our muscles become more efficient, so we burn less calories. So here's a great example of in people with running. And I think running's aerobic activity is a good example, just because your humans seem to adapt to it very well, especially from a muscular efficiency standpoint. So here, these are every week in this study, they added 20 minutes to the run. And so here's women and here's men. Calories were maintained. Calories weren't regulated like in a controlled feeding setting, but it was more of a keep your calories the same dietary advice situation. SMR is sleep metabolic rate, which is interesting that doesn't change. But what you see here with women, and you also see with men, the gray line is predicted. So based on their mileage, how many calories, here it's in megajoules for those of you that like scientific units. But here you see it goes up. This is how it would predict it to go, and then here's what actually happens. So again, with men, that's how it's predicted, and then that's what actually happens from an energy expenditure standpoint. So you can see, after 20 minutes of running, like on the subsequent weeks, it starts to decouple pretty quickly. So right here, if we look at kind of the other graph, right here, this is where activity kind of starts to decouple from caloric expenditure, that there starts to become these conservations in calorie burning despite increases in physical activity. And this is where I think diet becomes very important, because like in that study with the running, the diet was maintained, calorie intake was maintained irrespective of energy intake. So that we get these efficiencies and downregulations, they're made because the energy deficit is outside of, and I appreciate that this is not a very scientific term, the sweet spot, right, of that gap between expenditure and intake. So again, here's just kind of comparing the two, that we get this degradation of the energy gap. And so we need to start looking, how can we optimize this energy deficit? And oh wait, I took out a couple slides for time, but one of the other points that I'll just make is what can happen, and there's better data in this with weight loss than with athletes. But what happens is you get up to a 20% increase in muscular efficiency with weight loss, and you get an 80 to 90% decrease in non-physical activity, like a reduction in that non-physical activity in people who have lost weight, despite the fact that they're moving more. So people who have lost weight and are maintaining that weight, they move more, but they're burning less calories despite moving more. And part of that is due to increases in muscular efficiency, and then also other just downregulations that the body has. And what's interesting was that in one study, they gave people like this leptin, the hormone leptin, and they saw that giving someone leptin in that situation, it basically reset all those downregulations and efficiencies back to normal. So I don't think that leptin is like a miracle drug, but I think what that does is it suggests to us that there are these other factors. There are these hormonal factors which you can manipulate via food, and from both calorie intake and then also the type and amount of calories that you're eating, that can help correct these inefficiencies or these increased efficiencies in metabolism, which I think aren't putting our athletes and our clients in the best situation possible. So some other examples here that we get with a high energy intake, hunger and metabolic efficiency decrease while metabolism increases. So the more energy you're going to be taking in, while with low energy, hunger and metabolic efficiencies are going to increase while metabolism decreases. So how do we match up higher energy intake with higher energy output is really the direction where we need to go. And I'm not talking kind of like wanton high calorie intake of pizza and burgers and all that sort of stuff. But getting away from that messaging with athletes and clients that it's more activity, and more calorie restriction. That we need to get, it's more activity and then more calories, and kind of hold that energy gap at a higher level. So energy balance is really complicated. And to get an athlete to their competitive weight or body composition, eat less or run more shouldn't necessarily be our default answer, which I think historically it has been, because this idea of the constrained theory of energy expenditure and how you find that sweet spot between intake and output at this point is a little more art than science, because there are so many variables at play. So what this does is it requires us to look just beyond kilocalories, right? It needs us to look beyond just the calories that people are consuming. And the first place that we need to start looking is this idea between required nutrients and what's our required intake, and then what's the optimal intake for someone. And so when we're looking at kind of diet plans or helping people, just kind of giving diet advice on what people should be doing, and that we need to consider both the energy, kind of that calorie part of food, but then also that signaling part of food. Like what else does the food we eat do in our bodies? And so to give an example of this, I want to start with protein and talk about it in the context of dietary recommendations. So the RDA, or the recommended dietary allowance, right, is a number that's set by a group of scientists that basically says, what's the minimal amount of a particular nutrient someone could eat where they would not become deficient from those essential nutrients? And if you think people's needs are on a bell curve, kind of like different people have different needs just at a basic level due to our different biology, the RDAs are meant to cover 97 to 98% of the population. So if 97 to 98% of the population ate this amount of protein, we wouldn't have essential amino acid deficiencies. And the origins of the RDA come from World War II, when the government needed to figure out how much food can we send overseas and what's the least amount of food we can feed the people at home and keep them functioning, right, to send our supplies overseas to the soldiers. And so that's when they started figuring out these RDAs for different essential nutrients. So for protein, that leaves us at 46 grams for women and 56 grams for men, or like dinner last night, right, for me. And so if you think about whenever you hear people will get quoted, nutrition experts will get quoted saying, well, people are eating enough protein, right? People are eating too much protein. Americans eat on average about 90 grams of protein a day, which is greater than the RDA, right? So from a essential amino acid deficiency standpoint, we're doing really well. But is that an optimal intake for what we're trying to perform, right? I have never had a client, and I'd be surprised if you did, that comes to you, or an athlete that comes to you and is like, look, I just don't want to be deficient. Can you just make me, I just don't want to be deficient, I just want to be not dead, right? Like, they don't say, like, I want to be better, like, I want to optimize my sleep, I want to optimize my speed, they want to optimize. So how do we optimize? And so I don't think that to optimize, you don't just like make stuff up, right? What you do is you kind of keep looking, and what the science gives us is this other acronym, a little more confusing of an acronym. It doesn't like kind of have as nice of a ring as an RDA, and that's probably why it hasn't maybe caught on as much, because it's a mouthful. The AMDRs. And so the AMDRs is acceptable macronutrient distribution range. And it's a lot. I have a handful of little kids, and I don't think any of them would be able to put together acceptable macronutrient distribution range. So maybe that's kind of the popularity of the acronym just hasn't caught on. But what the AMDRs are is the same group of scientists that got together and came up with the RDAs. They said, well, if the RDAs are the amount to prevent deficiency in 97 to 98% of our population, but what's the range of intakes that we see in healthy diets? Like, what's the range of nutrients, that you could have in a healthy diet, and of different proteins, carbohydrates, and fats? And so for protein, it's 10 to 35% of calories, right? So the RDA, one of the places where scientists get a C+ on marketing messages is that the RDA is on a grams per kilogram basis, or on a grams basis, and the AMDRs are on a percent calorie basis. So it's kind of like you're talking two different languages from a units of measure standpoint. But if you're eating the RDA, you're basically at about 15% of your total calories from protein. So it's not in the middle, it's kind of on the low side of middle. But what this does is it gives you a range to work with from a protein standpoint, or a carbohydrate or a fat standpoint, because they have them for all of them. So then you can start asking questions, well, if we know that a healthy diet can have a protein intake in this range, then what's optimal within that? And one of the questions that's often posed with this is there a limit to how much protein is needed, right? And so if we were to say needed, like essential amino acid deficiencies, that would be the RDA. But needed to be the best athlete you're trying to be, needed for optimal function, optimal muscle growth and recovery, it's a different question. And so, does anybody know who this is? No? It's Beverly Hills Cop. Yes, got some people. So this is Billy Rosewood from Beverly Hills Cop. And Billy has played a much larger role in protein myths or guidelines than he probably thinks. So in the movie Beverly Hills Cop, Billy and Taggart are sitting there staking out Eddie Murphy, waiting for him to come out of this hotel, because Eddie Murphy's not supposed to be in Beverly Hills because he's a cop from Detroit, and it's all this other stuff. And so Billy Rosewood's reading this paper, and he says, wow, did you know it says here that by the time the average American is 50, he's got 5 pounds of undigested meat in his bowels? And so this sounds ridiculous, but you hear it all the time. And for my money, Billy Rosewood is the first person to have ever said this. I have spent more time than I should have trying to find out this idea of undigested food in your digestive tract. Like, who was the first person to say it? And it was in the early 80s. It was Billy Rosewood from Beverly Hills Cop. And it's amazing how many people quote this. He doesn't get the attribution he deserves, but it's amazing that how many people quote this. And this is kind of this idea that if you overeat protein, that, your body, I don't know, it sits in your digestive tract, or it just passes on right through. And kind of with my view of like survival is how the body works, like your small intestine is over 20 feet long, right? It's there to make sure that every nutrient is extracted before it leaves. And so this idea of undigested food is kind of crazy to me. But with protein, when we're looking to optimize, what the research is really showing is that a meal-based approach to protein intakes and timing is really where we need to be headed with people. And this, I think, is interesting because there's an overwhelming amount of scientific evidence to support this, but it hasn't really caught on. And I think part of the reason from a recommendation standpoint is dietary recommendations in America just aren't meal-based. They're day-based. If you look at kind of the guidance from My Plate, it gives you guidance on how many servings of different things that you should have on a day, not on a meal. So this is a little bit different. I feel like that's kind of the resistance from this catching on. And so with protein, why the meal-based system or strategy makes so much sense is because of the signaling that protein does outside of just the calories and the amino acid it contains. So here we have a piece of beef, and beef is rich in an essential amino acid called leucine. And now what leucine does is it can activate this cell signaling pathway, which contains mTOR, which is part of protein synthesis, so muscle translation, right? And it increases muscle protein synthesis and allows you to look like this gentleman right here. It's literally that simple. Well, it's not, but you know. But so this is an example of not energy, but signaling qualities of a nutrient. So if this happens, right, we know this process happens, the next question is, well, how much could we make this happen? Like, how fast could we drive this process? So there's a researcher named Doug Patton-Jones who's down at the medical branch of the University of Texas in Galveston. And Doug has asked this question, and if you've ever met Doug, he's like a tall, slender man. Like he's not a bodybuilder trying to figure out how he could, maximize his protein intake. He's more of a thoughtful Australian gentleman looking to figure out how astronauts could not become so emaciated when they're, in outer space. But it's very useful for athletes looking to get strong as well. And so what Doug did was he said, well, let's look at what people are eating from a protein standpoint. So if, say, on average, people are eating about 90 grams of protein, and we give that to them in one sitting, or we give them 30 grams of protein, like kind of a more reasonable portion, and we measure muscle protein synthesis, what happens? And so what he found was that whether you're eating 90 grams or 30 grams, and they used lean ground beef patties in this study, you got about a 46% increase in muscle protein synthesis. So from a muscle protein synthesis standpoint, from a muscle recovery standpoint, more is not necessarily better, that you get the same. So then the next question that was kind of asked, and this was a study that was done with a group, that Doug did with a group of researchers, they looked at, well, if we know that more is not better, let's look at how people are currently eating protein and see how we can optimize this. So this is generally how people eat protein. And it's called they call it the skewed protein distribution. So here we're 11 grams of protein at breakfast, 16 at lunch, double down on the chicken nuggets, right? And you get 63 grams of protein at dinner. So, and from my experience, this could be either an 8-year-old or an NBA professional basketball player, and they could eat the same way. So it kind of spans all groups and athletic abilities. But what we see here, and you'll generally notice, if anything, what it is that people generally eat a high-protein dinner. That's their largest protein meal of the day, and they eat much lower protein throughout the day. So what they did in this study was they said, let's take this skewed protein distribution, and let's not add more protein to the diet. Let's just redistribute that protein in a more even fashion that's more in line with that other study looking at muscle protein synthesis, hitting that 30-gram target. So again, here, if we're looking at kind of food provides us energy versus food is a cell signaling, right? The energy is the same. We're just spreading it out differently, timing it differently throughout the day. And what they found was when they redistributed this 90 grams of protein more evenly, there was a 25% increase in muscle protein synthesis over the course of the 24 hours. So this 25% increase sounds tremendous. And if I sold protein supplements, I'd try to convince you that was tremendous, right? But it's probably not going to make that big of a deal on like a one-off. Like if someone was like, I'm going to do this today and eat, a more evenly distributed protein intake, it's not going to have that much of an effect. I think what we get here, the cumulative effect, is where the magic comes in, especially when you start thinking about dealing with older populations who are trying to stay fit and healthy and fight sarcopenia and fight muscle loss as they get older. You can get upwards of a 1% loss of lean body mass as you age per year, right? So as you're getting older, you're losing that lean body mass, and some protein researchers think that just redistributing your protein and getting this extra 25% could be enough to help slow that down or even stop that muscle loss as you get older. So it's kind of a really important strategy. And unfortunately, with like muscle and muscle protein research, older could be like 40. It's not necessarily 60. Like as you get people who are old, quote unquote older in some studies are younger than you would think. And so this, I think, is a really important because it's a behavioral thing. It's a different way of looking at how you would eat breakfast that sets you up kind of for long-term views on how you're eating. And I would say that this idea of eating protein at breakfast is really difficult. And so that's probably the hardest one for people. I was presenting at a conference with Doug, and it was to a group of dietitians, and we were talking about this and some protein-related things, and I was talking protein and heart health. And afterwards, we had kind of an informal, what did you get out of the sessions that we were talking about? And an overwhelming number of those dietitians said that it was getting more protein at breakfast was something that they needed to work on. And that really struck me because these are people who have dedicated their lives to nutrition, and even they themselves were like, I'm not doing a good job at this. So you can think if nutrition professionals struggle with getting enough protein at breakfast, kind of a 16-year-old high school basketball player, right, or a 28-year-old, just person trying to get fit, they're really going to struggle. So protein at breakfast, and there's some other research which we don't have time to look at, but that shows that getting that adequate amount of protein at breakfast could probably be the most important time of the day because it actually has some ramifications on blood sugar later in the day, which is really interesting. So with protein, the key point here is that there's a threshold for protein synthesis at a meal. That overeating protein from a recovery standpoint maybe doesn't give you the benefit that you thought, and you can't make up for missed opportunities. So if you miss protein, if you have a low protein breakfast, you can't just eat more later to get that effect. This is definitely a kind of slow, steady, consistent wins the race kind of thing. So along the lines of signaling and what are these foods that we do, the foods that we eat, what else do they do? Protein is not just protein synthesis. And that's maybe where when we think about this, you'll hear well, your body can't process more than 30 grams of protein, right? Or what's the maximum amount of protein that you could eat at a meal? So if we're talking about protein synthesis, it's 30 grams. But if we're talking about other things, so protein has a very strong satiating effect, stronger than kind of any of the other, stronger than fiber, stronger than fat. Protein is the most satiating macronutrient. But those satiating effects don't kick in until you're getting about 30 grams of protein. And this really needs to be whole protein. So protein studies that are comparing liquid, Heather Leidy, who's now at Purdue, has done a lot of this research looking at liquid proteins versus solid proteins. Liquid proteins aren't satiating. They're basically as satiating as carbohydrates, which is in an acute, in a short-term standpoint, is not very satiating at all. Part of it just, they think, has to do with the fact that if you were to drink a protein shake, it gets digested so quickly that there's not enough time to set off the signaling cascades in your digestive tract to say, I've had this, I'm eating protein, it's very satiating. So you need a fair amount of protein to get the satiating effect, and it actually keeps going. So it's additive in protein, unlike with protein synthesis. So if you eat 50 grams of protein, right, it would be even more satiating. Now another thing about protein, and this really shows the satiating effect, is that if you're going to eat more protein, it makes it a lot easier to control calories. So this is one of my, and I joke that you're a real kind of legitimate science nerd when you have top 5 favorite research studies. I'm going to share with you 2 of my top 5 today. Save the others for later. But so this is definitely in my top 5. And so what happened with this study was they put people on a normal protein diet for several days, and it was controlled. So they had to eat, it was a controlled amount of food, controlled calories. And then they switched them to a high protein diet. So this is kind of like our kind of washout or baseline. And then they switched them to a high protein diet. Same thing, it was controlled, so they had to eat everything they were given. And then they put them onto the last part of the study, HP ad libitum. Ad libitum is science speak for eat as much as you want, right? Or also the easiest way to recruit people into your studies. Just tell them you can eat as much as you want. When I ran a clinical trial at Penn State when I was studying to get my PhD, and it was a controlled feeding study. So it was one of these, you can only eat what we give you every morning. And so you try recruiting, you're like, oh, well, that seems great. For 6 months, basically, someone cooks, you show up, they give you all the food and stuff. But as a 22-year-old trying to recruit during football season, they're like, so what about tailgating? I'm like, no, there's no tailgating. There's no beer. There's no. And so it was a lot more difficult than you would think. But yeah, so with this ad libitum, eat as much as you want. But kind of within reason, not like Golden Corral buffet style, eat as much until you can't walk. It's eat as much until you're full. But yet they had to maintain kind of this high protein intake, relative high protein intake. And what they found was people on their own started eating about 441 calories less per day, right? When they're put on this high protein kind of regulate yourself, which to me is amazing because, I mean, people just don't eat less voluntarily, right? But so this kind of shows a real world example of that satiating effect of protein.
Why wasn't the number of days controlled? And it looks like there's different time periods for each group.
This was much longer. These were more kind of baseline washouts. This would, like, the normal protein was just to kind of get everybody on the same page, not necessarily to test it, because they couldn't regulate their intakes here in either of those situations. So one of the things with more protein, what you get from a satiety standpoint is you get this better biology. So ghrelin, like I like to call ghrelin, is the hunger gremlin. It's the one hormone in our body that promotes hunger. So if you start eating less, if you start reducing your calories, your body starts to release ghrelin that says, by the way, I should eat more and I'm hungry. Protein decreases ghrelin, which makes, if you're trying to lose weight, it makes protein even more important, because one of the things, there was an 18-month study done in Australia where they severely cut people's calories. You put them on one of those fabulous, very low calorie liquid shake kind of diets. And people's ghrelin levels went through the roof, and then they had to maintain that low calorie intake for 12 months during weight loss, and then they had to maintain weight loss for another 6 months. And ghrelin levels were just as high a year and a half into the study as they were initially when they started cutting calories. So this kind of idea of your body gets used to being hungry is a false promise. Ghrelin levels are always going to stay elevated. So we got to find ways, how do we combat this? Protein is a way to do it. PYY, GLP-1, and CCK are hormones and compounds that will increase satiety, and so they'll increase feelings of fullness and kind of decrease your drive to eat, and protein also increases those as well. And things like CCK, for example, it's released from your small intestine, and it acts on your pancreas to kind of jumpstart the digestive process, but it also travels up to your brain to tell your brain that you're satiated. And so again, we're getting into this, this kind of, when protein hits your small intestine and it causes this release, that's not an energy, that's a signaling component of protein. So one of the things with the meal-based approach that's important to recognize is that research also shows us that there's this refractory period. So a refractory period in sciences general is a delayed response in the second of two closely spaced physiological stimuli. So basically what that means is when you eat protein, you need a space, there needs to be a time gap before you eat protein again, right? So a classic young Mike Roussell ignorant story would be, I kind of got into fitness and nutrition through bodybuilding magazines, right? And so that meant that there was a time in my life where I might have walked around with a gallon jug full of whey protein or branched chain amino acids and drank it throughout the day, right? Giving myself a constant stream of amino acids throughout the whole day, thinking, what could be more anabolic to an 18-year-old than that, right? This and the refractory period, and what protein research shows us, is it's like the total wrong thing to do. Because in order to maximize protein synthesis, you need a rise in your blood amino acid levels, and then it needs to fall. It's like a flux through the system that causes that increase. So if you're constantly eating, you're not going to get that flux, and thus you can't maximize muscle protein synthesis. So from a whole food meal standpoint, about 4 hours between meals is the place to go, because when you eat, it takes a little bit for it to come up, and then it takes a little bit to go down, which I think works in just the practical nature of how people eat, right? Eating every 4 to 5 or even 6 hours is a lot easier than every 2 to 3. So we really want to look at this. How are we getting protein evenly spaced throughout the meal with kind of time, at least a 4-hour time intervention between all of them? So now that we've talked kind of a fair amount about protein, I want to move and start talking about carbohydrates, because I think and looking at kind of the energy and then also the signaling natures of carbohydrates. Now with carbohydrates, this is easily the most talked about nutrient with regards to energy signaling, energy versus signaling this duplicity of nutrients, right? Because if you think like low-carb diet books, all low-carb diet books are based on this premises, that carbs aren't just energy, that they're also signaling molecules, right? They signal insulin. That's kind of the premises of all low-carb diet books. So here we have a potato with a nice insulin needle into it, right? Now, one of the things to appreciate with carbohydrates when we talk about this, and we're going to talk a lot about insulin sensitivity. So basically your body's responsiveness to increases in blood sugar. Like, is it very responsive or is it resistant? Is it insulin resistant? That it's a very much of a chicken and egg discussion, right? But there's kind of a lot in life is chicken or the egg, right? And at some point you got to jump on the hamster wheel in order to get it going. And I think there's not an answer here. Is it the chicken or the egg? I think that with these strategies, like, you just got to put them into play and then things get better. So one of the reasons we want high levels of insulin sensitivity, so why do we want our bodies to be essentially very responsive and able to deal with the glucose and the sugar that we eat, is we get better recovery because we can get glucose out of our bloodstream into our muscles more efficiently. We get better body composition because we don't get overshoots of insulin, which can cause hypoglycemia, overeating, and a variety of things. And like I said, this is kind of a chicken or the egg concept. So how do we improve insulin sensitivity? So fortunately, we have this really good punch list, body composition. And this is part of the chicken or the egg. So if you are leaner, like if you have more muscle mass and less body fat, you're going to be more insulin sensitive, right? And we know here, if you have high levels of insulin sensitivity, it's easier to get better body composition. So once you get going, it's really the spoils go to the victors, but you got to get started. And one of the ways you can get started is exercise. So I think exercise, and I have a slide about this in a minute, it's literally the most powerful drug you have access to with respects to improving how your body responds to the food that you eat. Because after you exercise, you get this almost immediate increase in improvement in insulin sensitivity, and the sugars and the carbohydrates that you eat can get preferentially shuttled to your muscles. Like, there's no other time and no other nutrient that you can do this with like exercise and carbohydrates. Genetics, unfortunately, blame your parents, but you're kind of stuck with those, at least for now. Maybe we'll be able to figure out some genetic modifications. Diet, so we're going to talk a lot about diet strategies. And then the other thing, which is definitely the do as I say, not as I do, sleep. So even whether it's acute sleep deprivation or chronic sleep deprivation have profound effects on insulin sensitivity and also hormones that regulate and can modulate insulin sensitivity. So getting 7 to 9 hours of sleep is a big game changer from an insulin sensitivity standpoint. If you're like me and you're just kind of like, I'll just focus on the other ones and not sleep at all, but that's also an option. Okay, so here is favorite study number 2. This is probably number 4 in the top 5 list. But this is going to get at the idea of carbohydrates as just an energy source, and also carbohydrates as a signaling molecule with respects to weight loss. So this was a study that they did at Tufts, and they did a low glycemic load diet and a low fat diet. So the low glycemic load diet was kind of like a zone diet, if anyone's familiar with that. It's like a 40% carbohydrates, moderate kind of starch, 30% protein, 30% fat. Have you guys heard of the zone diet? Yes? I could tell you, I gave a talk to first-year nutrition students at Penn State about a month ago, and I'm either getting old or they're getting less engaged, but in a room of 400 kids, no one had ever heard of the zone diet, which I'll tell you made me feel really old. Because that was when I first read that was kind of one of the things that got me like, wow, nutrition is amazing. But so here we have this low glycemic load diet, and we have more of a traditional low-fat weight loss diet. And you can see that I know it looks a little bit different, but it's essentially we're looking at the same reductions in body fat percentage. So regardless of the kind of diet, the carbohydrate amount, and slightly type that these people were given, same weight loss. But then what happened was they dug a little further. And so what probably happened here in kind of a realistic standpoint is they got these results. And the graduate student goes to his advisor, his or her advisor, and says, well, look, these are the findings from the study. And the advisor's like, I don't really know. I don't like this result. We need to dig a little deeper. Go back to your desk, come back in 2 weeks after you pour over the statistics and show me what else you have. And from my experience as a graduate student, that's where the magic happens, right? And so what they did here was they dug a little deeper and they separated people based on their insulin sensitivity. And so they said, well, if we take the people in the red who were insulin resistant, so who were not insulin sensitive, and then the people on the left, these people were very insulin sensitive. And what you can see here, the difference between the low glycemic load and the low-fat diets is that the people who were insulin resistant lost more weight or had greater changes in body fat percentage when they ate the low glycemic load diet. So kind of the slightly lower carbohydrates, probably lower starch kind of diet, as glycemic load diets generally are. Whereas if you have good insulin sensitivity, you can kind of do whatever you want, which is a theme that you'll notice kind of in research that looks at different types and amounts of carbohydrates. Like if you have good insulin sensitivity, I mean, game on, right? It's Rice Krispie treats and whatever you want to eat. But if you don't, you need to be a lot more cautious. Here's another example of a great acronym put together by scientists, the A to Z study. So this pitted the Atkins diet, the traditional, this is kind of dietary guidelines type nutrition, the Ornish diet, which is a very high carbohydrate, low fat vegetarian diet, and then the famous Zone diet that first year Penn State nutrition students do not know about, right? And we're recording this, so they'll definitely know about after this. So here what we have, aside from being the greatest bar graph I've ever created, is weight loss. So we have the books are the bars from all these different diets. Weight loss at 6 months. I didn't show you 12 months because at 12 months, basically weight loss was the same because nobody can follow a diet for 12 months. So I think looking at weight loss studies at 12 months is not very instructive. But what we see here, so basically there's a lot of similar results, but the low carbohydrate diet seemed to work the best. So this got a lot of press, right? And hence the boxer, the media pitted this was a great media story. So what didn't get a lot of press was a secondary analysis done by someone at Stanford. And what they did was they started to look at this idea of insulin sensitivity and response to diets. So this was a secondary analysis. So oftentimes in a secondary analysis, basically what that is you're not asking the question you designed the study to ask. You're asking another question, and so it's a lot harder to ask that question because you're not set up to look at it. So what you do is you often just look at the extremes because it's a lot easier to compare extremes to each other if you don't have the numbers to make the comparisons you want. So Atkins versus Ornish could not be more extreme from a carbohydrate standpoint. So they looked at the most insulin sensitive people, and they saw that, I know these look different, like 12 and almost 9 pounds, but they were the same. So the people who were the most insulin sensitive, whether they were on the Atkins diet or whether they were on the Ornish diet, lost the same amount of weight. But then they looked at the people who were the most insulin resistant, and they saw that those individuals lost significantly more weight, 11 pounds on the Atkins diet versus 4 pounds on the Ornish diet. Right? So again, it's this other example of people who are more insulin resistant, if we give them a diet that's more appropriate for their biology, that they seem to do better on that diet. Now, one of the things that should also know that I don't have a slide on it here is that these individuals on the insulin resistant people on the Ornish diet were also the least compliant, right? So then you're like, well, they were the least compliant, so did they lose the least amount of weight? That's probably one of the reasons, and that these people were also very compliant. My thought from that all is that people are very compliant when things work, right? Like rarely do you have someone who's trying to lose weight after they lose 5 pounds in the first 2 weeks, be like, man, I'm doing so good, I'm just gonna stop, right? Like no one says that. But very oftentimes when you're slogging at it for 4 weeks and you've only lost a pound, that's when people get really frustrated and they're like, well, I'm gonna have, the double bacon cheeseburger turkey sandwich with extra french fries, right? Because it's not working. So I think that is also, compliance is baked in here, but I think that an instructive take home that you can get from a secondary analysis is that giving someone a diet that's appropriate for their biology is gonna put them in a place to succeed. And with carbohydrates, we have the ability to do that. So what we need to do is we really need to, I think, template nutrition execution plans at some level so that we're maintaining the flexibility to adjust with respects to carbohydrate tolerance. So carbs aren't good and carbs aren't bad. It depends a lot on the individual. So kind of their personal biology and biochemistry, which if you were to draw a corollary, you could say like their body composition. So someone who is more overweight is gonna be, generally it's safe to make the assumption less insulin sensitive. so they're gonna be more insulin resistant, so they should get a lower carbohydrate type diet. Whereas if you're leaner, you're gonna have greater insulin sensitivity on average, not saying that some people can be lean and still have insulin resistance, but that those people could get more carbohydrates in their diet that's more biologically appropriate. And then I think you layer in these kind of the drug-like effects of exercise. So how exercise impacts carbohydrate tolerance, and that allows people of kind of all types of sensitivity to consume more carbohydrates to fuel their activities. So you could have an athlete who is overweight, right? But then you layer in their level of activity and they can eat more carbohydrates to fuel that activity when you put it around exercise when they're physiologically primed to have those carbohydrates. So it requires just an extra layer of thought beyond just carbs are good, carbs are bad, calories in versus calories out. So when we fuel with carbohydrates with exercise in mind, kind of a rule of thumb, this is my ruler of thumb here, is that like everyone can get a starch or grain-based carbohydrates after exercise, right? So after you exercise, whether you're insulin resistant or not, you get this improvement in carbohydrate tolerance. And this could be even with people who are kind of sedentary and very insulin resistant, this could be as much as just a walk. So what's also cool about this is the body's response from an insulin sensitivity standpoint scales on your level of fitness. So if you are just starting out, going for a walk is going to give you this boost in insulin sensitivity. So it's not, I think that's encouraging to people when they're first starting out. And then, how you layer in more starch and grain-based carbohydrates at the other two meals, if you're doing kind of like a breakfast, lunch, dinner thing, really depends on the goals, their activity, their age, because generally as we get older, we have poor insulin sensitivity, and then body composition. So there are a lot of other factors here that you kind of need to work with on an individual basis to give you that flexibility to optimize carbohydrates with kind of exercise in mind. So this is what I call, I created this idea, I call this the hierarchy of carbohydrates. And this is just like a very simple way that you can talk to people about carbohydrates. So the idea is, these are more carbohydrate dense foods are higher up, and as you go down, the foods are less dense in carbohydrates. So foods that contain added sugars, right, like a sugar sweetened beverage, is going to have a lot more carbohydrates per serving than, say, green vegetables like asparagus, right, which will have hardly any. And so if you're going to remove carbohydrates, or if you're going to have someone remove carbohydrates from their diet, you start at the top, right? You would get rid of added sugars and refined grains before you would ever tell them to stop eating blueberries. And you also want to tell people to eat more from the bottom and then move up and less at the top, because you can eat a lot more green vegetables and other vegetables for less calories and they're more satiating, right? And as you get up, per serving, it's less satiating and more calories. So it's kind of a very simple and kind of practical way for people to do this. So with exercise and athletes with carbohydrates, I think one of the other things we need to think about is that in athletes with high training volume, post-exercise liquid refueling is very important because glycogen replenishment is time dependent. So this is like a sports drink right after exercise for a high volume, high intensity kind of athlete. That's really important because their ability to replenish glycogen is greater right after exercise versus 2 hours after exercise. But if we're talking about kind of a general population weight loss client, that it doesn't really matter, and it's kind of a wasted form of calories. So if you have someone who's more of a general population weight loss client and they're training 3 days a week, having a sports drink right after they work out to replenish their glycogen stores is not the best strategy because one, if you're trying to lose weight and you're generally sedentary, calories are at a premium, right? And so people would much rather eat than drink their calories. And this time-dependent replenishment in glycogen is not an issue because they're not doing 2 a days or they're not doing 7 days a week, 3 hours at a time, right? They're doing 3 days a week for an hour. So your body can just replenish glycogen at other times. So next, I'm going a little over, so we're gonna have to go through metabolic flexibility a little bit quicker. And there's a lot of the same concepts with insulin sensitivity here, or insulin sensitivity plays a lot here. So metabolic flexibility is the capacity for an organism to adapt fuel oxidation to fuel availability. So basically, if you have carbs in your system, can you use those carbs for energy? If you don't have carbs and you have fat that's available, can you use that fat for energy? right? So it's basically, can you flip this switch back and forth depending on what you have as a fuel resource? Now, we often think, when we think about metabolic flexibility or inflexibility, generally just poor glycemic control is all we think about, because that's like insulin resistance. But there's this whole other side here that there's fat metabolic inflexibility too. And this would be a poor response to carbohydrate or calorie restriction, right? So everyone would know this person, like someone who tries to go on a low carbohydrate diet and it crushes them. You know, they just can't do it. They're super sluggish. They feel hypoglycemic. They get shaky. And not just kind of initially, like they just kind of never adapt to it. Those people have trouble on the fat oxidation side. So it's kind of metabolic flexibility in another way. So I'm sorry that this kind of got cut off. So this is a high carbohydrate diet. So this is a respiratory quotient. So kind of showing us what's getting oxidized. Up here is more carbohydrate oxidation. Down here is fat oxidation. So people are put on a high carbohydrate diet, and you would think the more carbohydrates you get, right, the more you would oxidize carbohydrates. So this would be the metabolic flexible response, the normal adaptive response. This is the inflexible response, that despite the increase in carbohydrates and the increase in availability, they aren't oxidizing more carbohydrates like they should. And it goes both ways. This is with a high-fat diet. So you can see these people start to oxidize a lot more, burn a lot more fat as they eat more and more fat, whereas these individuals, you don't get that steep increase. So again, this is the metabolic inflexible response. This is overnight fasting. So you can see, so this is basically people who, unless you're sleeping and eating, so people who are not eating, what happens? Here you get this increase in fatty acid oxidation the longer that you're sleeping and fasting, and here you get a blunted response. And this is also why, like intermittent fasting is becoming a lot more popular, why some people could do intermittent fasting and be successful with it, and other people cannot because of this metabolic inflexibility. So how can we improve metabolic flexibility? So optimize insulin sensitivity. Metabolic inflexibility is a good predictor, actually, of future risk of diabetes. So if we can do all the things that we want to do to improve insulin sensitivity, that's a good way to do it. Exercising in different nutritional states. So, can someone exercise? And for an athlete, I think this is not like a game day thing that you test, but can an athlete, and is it relevant for them to be able to exercise, carbed up or without, fuel, without carbs? Like if you're running a half marathon and your strategy is to consume, energy drinks and gels and different things throughout the entire marathon, right? You're always going to be in a glucose-driven state. So you're not necessarily concerned about your ability to oxidize carbohydrates. But if you're doing a longer type run, maybe like an ultra, and fuel isn't, foods aren't going to be as available, you need to make sure that your body's ability to access and use fat is there. And so can you exercise in different nutritional states? I think you optimize but don't overdo carbs, so you're giving your body the opportunity to oxidize fat and use fat as a fuel when there aren't a lot of carbohydrates. And then we'll talk about this in just a minute because I'm running out of time here. Relying on fat to make up the energy gap. So traditionally in nutrition, the idea was you kind of set protein, you set fat at a certain amount of calories, and then you use carbohydrates to fill the difference. And then if you exercise more and more and need more carbohydrates or more energy, you just give them more carbohydrates. And I think what we do here is instead we give them more fat to make up that energy difference. And that allows this ability to get access to both kinds of fuels instead of creating a hyper carbohydrate environment. Okay, so this is the last bit on diet and performance. Like how do we navigate this maze or kind of a lot of these ideas that I've been talking about? So I have three slides here for this. So first is you make protein the keystone of your plate. So you anchor your plate when you're talking about like how do I put together a meal. You anchor your plate with protein. And I think when you do that, it makes meal planning a lot different. If anybody is a believer in fruits and vegetables, like I'm a big vegetable guy. I would tell you I eat more vegetables than any vegetarian you know, right? But I don't build any of my meals around broccoli, right? Because from a meal planning strategy, it's not how I think about making meals. It makes it more difficult. It's a lot less exciting too, right? But if you start with protein, like you say, like I'm gonna have this piece of salmon for dinner. Now, what else are we going to do around it? And especially when you think of that skewed protein distribution, getting protein at breakfast and getting protein at lunch is a problem for people getting adequate amounts. So if you start with that as the initial piece, and then you build the rest of your meal around it, it allows you to optimize protein a lot easier. Now, carbohydrates, it's a lot more complicated / flexible. So I think we need to take a physiologically driven carbohydrate allotment strategy, right? So that the amount of carbohydrates someone eats, it's based on their insulin sensitivity, which is tightly linked to body composition, their activity levels, metabolic flexibility, which is also tightly linked to insulin sensitivity, their overall health, and then kind of the in-season, off-season cycle if they're an athlete. You know, like in the off-season, you kind of have a lot more leeway to play around with different kinds of nutritional interventions, whereas in the on-season, when it's game time, you don't really want to mess around with things as much. So there's a lot of flexibility in carbohydrates, and I really think we need to get away from this like good, bad, high, low carbohydrate thing that's very dependent on the individual and also what they're doing. So again, kind of these rules of thumb for exercising or fueling with exercise in mind. And then with fats, who I've not done fats any justice, but they are important. And generally at a meal, fats are inversely proportional to carbohydrates. This is how I like to structure it. So if you think, you kind of eat similar sized caloric meals throughout the day, protein stays the same, balanced, but you're gonna eat more carbohydrates around the exercise, so those meals are gonna be lower in fat. And then other times of day, when you're not eating as many carbohydrates, you're relying more on fruits and vegetables, those are gonna be your higher fat meals. That we fill this calorie gap with fat, like I talked about. And then when you're starting out, kind of about a third or about 30% of your calories from fat is a good place to start. And then it kind of scales up or down based on how much food that person's eating. And so really to get about a third of your calories, you're looking at a tablespoon of oil at lunch and at dinner, a couple eggs at breakfast, and then nuts as a snack. If you were to do that, plus kind of the residual fats that are in the foods we eat, that gets you about a third of the way. So it's kind of a reasonable goal that's easy for people. And then with the types of fats, not to get too granular, but this has become more and more of a discussion, monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, and saturated fats, that I don't really think the data suggests that one we hold up more than others. That if you're at this about 30% of calories, that an even distribution of 10% of each is the prudent way to go. There's really, despite a lot of kind of popular media, there's no good evidence to eat more saturated fat. I think what we've seen with cardiovascular research has shown that restricting saturated fat to lower and lower levels is probably not as beneficial as we thought, because people just end up replacing that with simple carbohydrates, right, which is no good. But this has really been translated into a message of that eat as much saturated fat as you want, which I think is not a good message for people, because it's kind of free reign to eat a lot of foods that aren't good for them. And there's one study that showed when people overate either PUFAs, so polyunsaturated fats, or saturated fats, they got greater increases in lean body mass when they were overeating the polyunsaturated fats versus saturated. And there's some interesting kind of animal and monkey research that shows overconsumption of monounsaturated fats can actually lead to atherosclerosis. So I think that if you just kind of, an even distribution of all of them is a prudent and good way to go. 2 slides on just kind of the behavior, kind of that food logistics side, right, that I think are important to consider, trying to take the things that we talked about and then how do you actually get people to do it. Motivational interviewing, I call this, it's the greatest book no one's ever finished, because it's about this thick, and a half an hour into it you're falling asleep. But I love it. I don't want to say I love this book. My favorite quote from the book: people are reluctant to commit to making a change unless they have some confidence that it's possible, right? So how can we instill the feeling in people that it's possible for them to make that change? Even if you're just talking about getting protein at breakfast, right? Even simple stuff. Like, how do we make them feel that it's possible? It's so important. On the flip side, it's also important to realize that people are less reluctant to change if they don't give a damn, right? Like, if they don't care, it makes it very hard to make those people change. And it's not worth kind of banging your head against the wall trying to get somebody to change who doesn't. And unfortunately, what happens is we tend to put more effort in the people who are resistant in hopes that we'll just fix them, right? But it's not a fruitful battle. And then I think we're better off putting more effort in the people who are really responsive, and those other people will come along, eventually. So a 3-part summary, that things I'm hoping you get out of this: energy balance is fluid and relative to the balance of calories in versus calories out. So it's not as rigid as we've thought. that we need to look beyond essential to what is optimal from both an energy standpoint and then also a signaling standpoint, how the foods we eat, signal and drive processes in our bodies. And that we want to start our meals with protein, we add carbohydrates based on the individual, and then we fill that energy gap with fats. That would be my one sentence way on how to optimize their diet. So I've gone a little bit over, but this is my email, and that on Twitter or Instagram, that's my social handle. I'd love it if anybody has questions, you can email me or you can come up and ask me any questions. I'm around for a little bit before I have to head out of here. Thank you all so much for coming out on a Sunday morning. I really appreciate it.